Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a brand new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode Caught in the Act, 20 Cases of Observed Abductions. UFO abductions are not nearly as rare as used to be thought. They possibly number in the thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions, according to the Roper survey, which found that 1 in 50 people show the markers of a UFO abduction. So this might be quite common, but what isn't common are cases of observed abductions. There are almost no cases of outside witnesses observing people being taken on board UFOs. Researchers believe they know the reason for this, which is because ETs cover their tracks very well. They will divert abductees to remote locations. They will stop traffic. They will put people in a hypnotized or asleep state or suppress their memories. They use various techniques to sort of make sure that these abduction cases are not observed by outside witnesses. And yet there is a handful of cases in which abductions have been observed. It's so rare as to be almost statistically insignificant. But there are enough cases, I think, that it deserves a closer look. And that's what this episode is about. I think these cases reveal some pretty interesting insights into the nature of the UFO phenomenon. So let's just get started, because I've got 20 cases I'd like to cover. Case 1, Rivelino Mafra da Silva. This is a very well-known case in its country, Brazil. This occurred on August 20th, 1962. On that evening, Rivelino and his 3 sons were in their home when they observed shadowy figures moving about the house, and it was shortly later they saw UFOs, 2 glowing objects described, and I quote, 2 large ball-shaped objects which were hovering outside their home. So this was observed by Rivelino and his 3 young sons. But at this point, Rivelino became somehow hypnotized and started walking towards the objects, as if in a trance. And as his 3 sons watched, this object began to approach their father, and it emitted a thick yellow smoke. The smoke engulfed Rivelino, and when it cleared, he was gone. And so were the 2 UFOs. This, of course, frightened the kids badly. They immediately called the police, and an investigation ensued, during which the boys were accused of murdering their father. The boys, of course, denied this. They stuck to their story. They were questioned extensively and could not be swayed from their story. It was later learned that Rivelino himself, or perhaps his neighbors, actually had a prior encounter the day before in which his co-workers or him, Rivelino himself, saw a pair of 3-foot-tall beings walking past Rivelino's house. These were dwarf-like beings. They were digging a hole in the dirt next to the home, and when spotted, ran into the bushes. Shortly later, a glowing red UFO took off from the bushes and disappeared. Needless to say, Rivelino was never found. So that is the first case of an observed abduction. The second case I call Case 2, Filiberto Cardenas. This is probably my favorite case of this kind, and certainly one of the best verified. It's very well known in the UFO field. It took place on January 3rd, 1979, when Filiberto Cardenas was driving with his best friend, his wife, and his best friend's wife. 4 people were in the car driving outside of Hialeah, Florida. At this point, their car mysteriously stalled. So Filiberto and his friend got out, lifted up the hood, and were examining the engine. And at this point, they both heard a very loud buzzing noise coming from overhead. And meanwhile, in the car, their two wives could see a large black object hovering over the men, not that high up. At this point, the two men discovered that they were paralyzed, unable to move, and Filiberto himself was levitated in full view of all three witnesses and abducted inside this object, which quickly flew off. As Filiberto was being lifted up, all three witnesses heard him screaming, "Don't take me! Don't take me!" But of course the object did, and immediately the three remaining people drove directly to the police and reported their story. The police began a search, and it was a few hours later that they found Filiberto in a field about 10 miles away from the original location. He was quite disoriented, but appeared to be fine. He was reunited with his friends and his wife about 1 hour later, and the Hialeah, Florida Police Department filed an official report detailing this abduction of Filiberto Cardenas by a UFO. This account was told in the book UFO Contact from Undersea by Virgilio Sanchez Osejo and Wendell C. Stevens. This case generated quite a bit of attention in the UFO community, and in fact, Filiberto was interviewed by J. Allen Hynek. This was actually just one of several abductions, and Filiberto was eventually taken to what appeared to be an undersea base, along with his wife, and given many predictions. It's quite a remarkable case, but important here is that it was absolutely observed in full view of three other people. This is extraordinarily rare, but again, it does happen. That moves us along to Case 3, Oliver Lurch, which might be one of the first reported cases of a UFO abduction. This occurred on Christmas Eve, 1890, when 20-year-old Oliver Lurch was abducted by something outside of his home in South Bend, Indiana. The event began when Oliver's mother asked him to fetch a pail of water from the well outside their home, and he walked outside the house, and suddenly everyone in the house heard him screaming, "Help! Help! It's got me!" Everybody in the house dashed outside. They could still hear Oliver crying for help. However, his voice now was coming from above. Everybody scanned the sky, but nothing could be seen. What they did see was Oliver's tracks in the snow, leading about halfway to the well, at which point they stopped and disappeared. They searched the entire area, including the well, but Oliver Lurch was never found. So was he abducted by aliens? It's hard to say what exactly happened, but they did hear his voice allegedly coming from above. This is a controversial case. Researchers have looked into it, and some believe that it's actually a hoax printed in the newspaper for attention. As it turns out, there is a story, a fictional story by a very well-known author, Ambrose Bierce, which has many details in this story which are identical to this account. So some believe that this case is basically a hoax. Hard to say for sure, but I present it here for what it's worth. And it's not the only case. We now move along to Case 4, Martin Cohen. This case took place in Leeds, England on June 30th, 1988. It's a pretty interesting case. At 10:30 p.m. on that evening, Martin Cohen was walking through Roundhay Park in Leeds. This is a very large park, when he says he was struck by a purple beam of light from a flying object. He was levitated quickly up in this beam of light and into the object, at which point he lost consciousness. The next thing he knows, he is being deposited via this same beam of light back into the park, and it's now several hours later. Meanwhile, that evening, according to the news desk at the Yorkshire Evening Post, they received several anonymous calls from people who said that they had seen, quote, a purple light in the park with a man in the center of it. Some of these apparently saw this man being pulled up, Martin Cohen, and others saw him being deposited. One of the witnesses allowed his name to be used. His name is Michael Cotran, and he was jogging in the park that morning when he saw, quote, a purple glow ahead of him in the park. The glow disappeared to reveal a man lying on the ground unconscious. Michael Cotran ran up to the man who he actually thought had died, and the man, of course, turned out to be Martin Cohen, who had been abducted several hours earlier into this object. So this case did generate a lot of interest from researchers in England. They converged on the case and interviewed the gentleman. There are a few researchers who felt that Michael Cotran and Martin Cohen were hoaxing. However, they had no proof of this, and both men refused to retract their story. They absolutely stuck to their story and said that this happened. So while they were accused of possibly making it up, there's no evidence that they did. So it's a very interesting case, to say the least. I find it convincing because of the accounts of the phone calls being placed towards the Yorkshire Evening Post. And now we move along to the next case. Case 5 is anonymous. This case occurred on June 14th, 1994 in northeast Arkansas. The witnesses are also anonymous. I'll call them Kevin and his girlfriend Janice, who were driving along Highway 40 at around 1:30 a.m. through northeast Arkansas. At some point, Kevin became disoriented and for some weird reason took an exit off of Interstate 40. He had not meant to do this, and so he was trying to find his way back onto the freeway when something very strange happened. He came upon a house that was glowing in light, and this puzzled him, so he actually got out of the car to take a closer look. And as he says, I walked around the back of the car, which is sitting in the middle of the road. I stopped and listened. Crickets were chirping, tree frogs were crying, lightning bugs were lighting. Nothing was out of place except for the 2-story Waltons-looking house lit up brighter than day. So he says this house reminded him of the house on the television series, The Waltons. At any rate, he was quite startled by this, so he crept down the driveway of the home and approached within 30 feet of this house. And as he says, then I saw what was bothering me. It wasn't that the house was lit up brighter than daylight. It was lit up inside and out. Bright, inside and out. How in God's name? Then I crept a couple of feet and I saw what haunts me to this day. Hovering above the house was a craft, according to Kevin, and it was, he says, close enough to toss a rock and hit it. He said it was a huge black triangular-shaped object, and he, prior to this, was skeptical of UFOs. He actually was an ex-military officer, quite familiar with aircraft, and did not believe in UFOs, but now seeing this, he saw something. He says, quote, I can't explain. The craft was stable, had no hum, whine, or rumble. Silent. I'm taking this all in. I'm seeing a large craft, not man-made. Wow. At this point, he heard his girlfriend Janice calling for him to come back into the car, and he said, no, you come out, take a look at this. So she did. She joined him, and he pointed to this object hovering above the house. She became extremely frightened and said, we have to run away. And Kevin pointed out that there was no use running. If this was truly a UFO coming from other star systems, there was no way they could possibly outrun it. And she was very frightened, but Kevin said he had no fear whatsoever and told her, let's just look for a few more seconds. And this is when things went from weird to truly bizarre. As Kevin says, just then it got crazier. A woman floated out of the light and in through a closed window. I told my girlfriend, okay, I'm done. Get in the car. This is too much. And we got back in the car and left. So this was reported to NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, or MUFON, because they felt that this was an event that deserved to be known. And I agree, it's a very unusual case of an observed abduction, and it's certainly not the only one. We now move to case 6, a farmer from Hobbs, New Mexico. We do not have the name of this farmer, but this case was revealed by Leonard Stringfield, who is a very well-respected researcher. This occurred in a September day in 1974. And this anonymous farmer was driving his pickup and had just approached his home in the town of Hobbs, New Mexico, at which point a huge, quote, disc-shaped object descended over the fields about 500 feet over his barn and almost directly over the farmer. The farmer was amazed and leaned out of his window and was looking up at the object. Meanwhile, watching from the home was the farmer's wife, daughter, and neighbor. And according to Leonard Stringfield, and I quote, suddenly before their eyes, the pickup truck with the farmer in it was lifted vertically from the ground and vanished into the underbelly of the disc. Hysterically, the farmer's wife called the police. Needless to say, this farmer was not returned. He was never seen again. Though according to Stringfield, this case is quite reliable. As Stringfield says, the facts of this case, still incomplete, are in the confidential files of the International UFO Registry. The investigator in this case is a radio newsman, prefers to remain anonymous. Through a good source, he got the basic information about the incident from an officer, only on the basis that the names and most of the data be kept confidential until the victim was found, dead or alive. So apparently this came as a leak from the police station itself in Hobbs, New Mexico. So yeah, this is a very interesting case of an observed abduction, and again, the person was not returned. According to Stringfield, and I quote, the mystery of missing persons linked to a UFO is a sensitive subject. Most publicized cases involving missing persons and UFOs turn out to be cultish shenanigans. Occasionally, one like the Hobbs case takes on serious overtones. Interestingly, just 2 years later, Stringfield would investigate another similar case involving an entire family that disappeared following a UFO encounter. So there you go, yet another case, and there's another one right behind it. We now move to case 7, Kelly Conway. This occurred way back in 1973. Prior to that, a gentleman by the name of Steve Omar, a resident of Hawaii, started to hear about numerous UFO sightings in the area. He was intrigued by this and started collecting the reports, and before he knew it, he became a UFO researcher. He formed a UFO group, started holding meetings, speaking publicly on the subject and on the radio. He started publishing a newsletter and really started looking into these local sightings. And by 1973, sightings were so numerous in the Hana district of Maui, Hawaii, that members of this UFO group decided to conduct a first-hand field investigation in the area. Steve Omar didn't go on this particular outing, but the director of the group, Kent Liscombe, the secretary of the group, Kathy Conway, Conway's brother, and Conway's boyfriend and a few others all went to camp at a location known as the 7 Sacred Pools. This was where most of the activity was taking place. I've actually been to this area. I've swam in the 7 Sacred Pools, so I know this area quite well. At any rate, Steve Omar got an incredible shock when his group returned the next day saying that Conway was missing and that she had been taken inside a UFO and that this event was actually viewed by her brother. As Steve Omar says, and I quote, "That day, Kent Liscombe, her brother, and the others arrived at my office, shocked. Her boyfriend was traumatized. They said my secretary, Kathy Conway, had been abducted by a UFO at 7 Sacred Pools, witnessed by her brother. It, the UFO, moved out over the ocean near the pool's stream end, and she swam under for a closer look. A beam from the UFO hit Kathy. It flew off and never returned. Her brother was shocked. She vanished. Kathy's boyfriend is now one of my best friends and was so in love with Conway, he has never gotten over it. Kathy never showed up for work as scheduled and never phoned, wrote, or contacted us ever again. She was a very reliable, responsible employee. No internet search has found her." At the time of this incident, UFO abductions were not very well known. They had just started to be reported. So this event took Steve Omar and his UFO group by complete surprise. As Steve says, and I quote, "This case was the first abduction we had ever heard of in Hawaii. By 1973, there were hundreds of new abduction reports, a part of ufology that had been rare before the 1970s. However, books and magazines were full of abducted people who returned. We had never heard of an abducted person never returning." That does seem to be a pattern in some of these cases. However, this next case is even more alarming. Case 8. Todd Sees. This case took place on August 4th, 2002 in Northumberland, Pennsylvania. Early that morning around 5:30 a.m., a farmer in the area noticed that his horses were skittish, and looking up he saw a round object hovering over some power lines above Montour Ridge. Suddenly this object moved a few hundred feet to the east, stopped, sent down a blue-white beam of light to the ground, and according to the report on this case, which was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, and I quote, "What was seen next was very unnerving. He saw what appeared to be a man suspended in the light. He was being pulled up head first. He was moving his arms slowly in the light. What looked like a man was being pulled up into the bottom of the craft. A few seconds later, it started shuddering, went west very fast, stopped briefly, then went straight up and out of sight. The whole incident lasted about 10 minutes. Meanwhile, there were other witnesses, including 3 fishermen on the Susquehanna River who saw the object flare up, dart upwards, and disappear, and 2 other farmers reportedly saw an object hovering over the power lines." And here's where this case starts to get really bizarre, because it turned out on that day, a gentleman by the name of Todd Sees, he was 39 years old, a resident of the area, had gone deer hunting up Montour Ridge, where this object had been seen. He told his family he would be back around noon. He left at 5 a.m., and noon arrived, and Todd Sees did not come home. So his family went looking for him and found no sign of him. They did find his 4-wheeler parked about 2 miles from his home at the west end of Montour Ridge. So they called the police, and the next day he was declared missing, and a huge search was launched. More than 200 volunteers and a bunch of rescue dogs covered Montour Ridge. Fire Chief Leon Geis headed the search and actually brought in 6 teams of canine search dogs. And these tracking dogs and bloodhounds were unable to pick up Todd C's scent. A state police helicopter crisscrossed the ridge and found no sign of Todd either. And it was about 30 hours after Todd had officially disappeared at 9 p.m. on August 5th that one of Todd's family members found his body in a wooded area at the base of the ridge, only a few hundred feet from his home and about 2 miles from where he had parked his four-wheeler. What's weird is that this area had already been very thoroughly searched and nothing was there. Todd's body was found face down. He was undressed except for his underwear and had a red rag tied around his arm. He was holding his throat and had an expression of fear on his face. There were no visible signs of trauma on his body. However, next to him there was a dead rattlesnake, but they could not find any bite on his body. So immediately, agents from the FBI came in, quarantined the area, and would not let anyone else in, including family members. And later, an autopsy revealed that Todd C's had apparently expired 24 hours earlier, but no immediate cause of death could be determined. Toxicology tests were inconclusive, and officials told the family that Todd may have had an allergic reaction to bee stings. This explanation was not accepted by Todd's family. And as it turns out, their officials weren't certain either, because they held Todd's body for 2 months before finally returning it to the family. And for a month following this incident, military helicopters were seen by the family and other residents in the area crisscrossing over Montour Ridge, where Todd had disappeared. And it was 3 weeks after Todd's death that one of his boots was actually found in the top of a tree, but no other trace of him was ever found. So this is certainly a grim case. I don't know quite what to make of it. As far as I know, it's actually unique. None of the other cases involve this outcome. But there are other cases for sure. We now move to case 9, Rado. We do not know Rado's last name. This is a case which was brought to our attention by Ukrainian researcher Mare Koiva. This occurred on October 7th, 1989 in Vinnitsa, Ukraine. A 10-year-old boy by the name of Rado was in his bedroom with his pet dog and cat when he says 3 tall human-looking figures came through the wall into his bedroom. There were 2 men and 1 woman, and they all wore silver-colored coveralls, jumpsuits, and they asked Rado to come with him. And Rado said he'd only go if he could bring his dog and cat along. And the figures agreed, and Rado found himself floating through the wall towards 2 disc-shaped objects which hovered just above the ground in his yard. Rado entered one of the discs and found himself visiting what appeared to be another planet. And he said that the people there all had very large, kind of glowing eyes. At some point, the ETs drew a sort of tattoo-like figure on Rado's body. And around 6 a.m. the next morning, this is when there were outside witnesses. Rado's grandmother woke up to find that Rado was missing, and nor could they find his dog or cat. She looked outside and saw that the chain where the dog was kept was actually floating perpendicularly in the air, and looking up, she saw the dog floating down from the sky and onto the ground. Meanwhile, Rado's brothers were astonished to see Rado himself float down by the roof and into a second-floor window where he was gently deposited onto his bed. Rado told them what had happened and pointed to the marks on his body which were drawn by the ETs, and these marks disappeared after one day. It's a very unusual case, but again has outside witnesses, which absolutely lends a level of corroboration and credibility to these cases. And now we move to the next case, which is Case 10, Amy Rylance. Some researchers have called this an incredibly well-verified case, although there are others who feel like there may have been a hoax. How this all began was on October 5th, 2001, when Keith and Amy Rylance, a married couple from Australia, and their friend Petra Heller were watching television in their home in Australia. It was around 9:30 p.m. and they each went to bed for the night, and about 2 hours later, Petra came out from her bedroom, and to her complete shock, she saw Amy Rylance, unconscious, floating out the window in a bright beam of light and into, quote, a huge spaceship that was hovering outside their home. She fainted and immediately woke up and screamed for Amy's husband, Keith. By the time Keith rushed outside, the object was gone. However, vegetation below where the object had hovered appeared to be burned. Keith immediately called the police and told them what happened. The police were skeptical about the UFO story, but 90 minutes later, an hour and a half later, Amy Rylance was found at a gas station in Mackay, Queensland. This is almost 500 miles away, an 8-hour drive at the quickest. So Amy Rylance was extremely disoriented. She was dehydrated. She had unexplained marks on her body. She was so disoriented she even had trouble remembering her own name. But she did quickly recover and recalled being taken into a brightly lit room where she says tall figures started taking bodily samples from her. A police investigation followed, and some of the investigators felt that this might have been a hoax, though this was never proved and there was no evidence to support a hoax. And in fact, the evidence showed that this probably took place. Certainly the details that Amy described are things we've heard in many other cases. Marks on the body, extreme disorientation, dehydration, these sort of things. And Amy, to her credit, agreed to give a notarized statement attesting to the truth of her story, and all three witnesses were extensively interviewed. This did get a lot of press attention, but when it started to get a lot more attention, all three witnesses withdrew from the public eye and sort of disappeared from public view. So it's an interesting case of an observed abduction, and it's not the only one. We now move to Case 11, Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber is hugely well known. I don't really need to tell you who he is. He was a fiction author who came forward as a UFO experiencer. And his experiences have been very vividly described in many books that he has written. And he had a very interesting encounter where he very nearly observed his son being taken. This occurred on April 2nd, 1986. And in the middle of the night, Whitley went to go check on his son and had, as he says, quote, the most appalling experience of my life. He walked into his son's bedroom, who was just a very young infant, and his son was gone. he raced through the house. And as Whitley says, a few minutes later, I'd searched every closet and room. I had to face the fact that my 7-year-old son was not in the house at 3:20 in the morning. At this point, he ran outside to check the yard, and looking up, he saw a massive black object hovering a few hundred feet above the house. As Whitley writes, "Suddenly I realized what was happening. That was a gigantic unknown object up there, and my son must be in it." I had interrupted the visitors in the middle of one of their abductions. At this point, a gray ET appeared next to Whitley and compelled him to return upstairs. As Whitley writes, "I might as well have been paralyzed for all the control I had over myself." He went back to bed and fell asleep. He woke up the next morning, rushed into his son's bedroom, and his son was asleep in bed. So although Whitley didn't actually see his son being taken, he came darn close. So I included this case in this video because it is pretty much a case of an observed abduction. Moving along to the next case, we now move to case 12. Jason Andrews. This is another really extraordinary case of very high credibility. Jason Andrews is a very well-known abductee from England. His mother, Anne Andrews, has in fact written 3 books about his case and her own experiences with UFOs and extraterrestrials. After many, many inexplicable incidents, including close-up UFO sightings, entity encounters, and more, they finally came to the conclusion that Jason was in fact being taken by ETs. And as he grew up, this activity not only continued but intensified. And in 1996, when Jason was 13 years old, he was being abducted from his room regularly. On several occasions, Anne woke up to find that her son was missing from the house. And on each occasion, she'd return to sleep, and Jason would be back in his bed the next day. One night in early 1996, Paul Andrews, the husband, and Anne were woken up by sounds coming from Jason's room. They got up to investigate and found Jason's older brother, Daniel, sitting on Jason's bed, holding Jason's stuffed teddy bear and crying. "The bastards have taken him again," Daniel said. "I knew it was happening, but I couldn't move. I couldn't stop it. I hate them." So Anne tried to comfort her son Daniel and reminded him that Jason has always been returned. Meanwhile, Paul, Jason's father, became very angry and said, "I'm getting the police. I've had just about enough. It's out of hand. This is not what normal families go through." Ultimately, they decided not to call the police. They knew that was just opening up a can of worms. Instead, they called another abductee who was helping to counsel them through this whole situation. And Anne was speaking with this abductee on the phone when Jason was returned in the living room right in front of her. Suddenly the room, quote, filled with an intense white light. There was a loud crackling sound like thunder. Their dog Chisholm began whining in fear. The light became dim. Then the dog Chisholm suddenly ran to the foot of stairs and began barking happily, and there was Anne's son, Jason, walking down the stairs toward them. Jason explained that he had been taken to see one of the, quote, tall beings who told Jason that they had been watching Earth for hundreds of thousands of years and that they knew all about Jason's family. So there you go, another case. They actually saw him being returned into their home. A really shocking case of an observed abduction, or very closely to being observed, is very well known, and this is case 13, Frederick Valentic. There are a number of cases in which pilots have seen UFOs and then disappeared, and this is one of them. On October 21st, 1978, Frederick Valentik was flying a single-engine Cessna over Bass Strait in Australia when he reported a UFO covered with bright white lights. This was just a test flight. This object approached and then began to hover above Frederick's plane. He said it was shiny and metallic and had a green light on it. He said the object appeared to be toying with him and was orbiting above his plane. His own plane, he said, was experiencing engine problems and had begun to idle roughly. And he was in contact with the tower control operator, Steve Roby, and was telling him all these details. And he told Steve Roby, "It's hovering and it isn't an aircraft." And then suddenly and without any warning, the radio transmission was cut off in midstream. There was a sound that Steve Roby described as a metallic scraping sound, and then total silence. Steve Roby immediately reported the event to authorities, and a days-long search ensued. Unfortunately, nothing was ever found, no wreckage. Frederick Valentik was never seen again. UFO investigators did uncover several eyewitness reports of UFOs in the same area at the same time of Frederick's disappearance. There were some skeptics who tried unsuccessfully, I think, to debunk the case. This case has never been solved, and Frederick's family, and certainly his father Guido, believe that he had been taken by a UFO and never returned. And it's not the only case like it. We now move to Case 14, FELIX MONCLA Jr. and Robert Wilson. This is also known as the Kinross incident. This is fairly well known. It occurred on November 23, 1953, when the U.S. Air Defense Command radar tracked a UFO traveling over Lake Superior at an estimated speed of 500 miles per hour. They immediately scrambled an F-89C Scorpion jet interceptor from nearby Kinross Air Force Base to pursue the object. Lieutenant Felix MONCLA Jr. was the pilot, and Robert Wilson was the onboard radar operator. And Robert Wilson watched the radar screens, which showed this object getting closer and closer. This was also reportedly seen on ground radar. The two blips got closer and closer, and suddenly the images on the screens merged, and the UFO flew off. A massive search was launched to find the missing pilots and the missing jet, but neither were ever found. And these two pilots were declared missing and presumed dead. At first, this incident received zero publicity, but thanks to researcher Donald Kehoe, he found out about it and began an investigation. And in 1958, Donald Kehoe actually obtained an Air Force document which quoted one of the radar observers who said, quote, "It seems incredible, but the blip apparently just swallowed our F-89. And this event became famously known as the Kinross incident. And according to Sergeant O.D. Hill of Project Blue Book, it was only one of many such incidents that had officials worried at that time. The vast majority apparently had been covered up by the U.S. government. So yeah, the pattern is becoming quite clear in these cases, many of which involve people who are not returned. And that's what happened in the next case, Case 15, involving an anonymous pilot. This occurred in June of 1965, and the witness is 16-year-old Jim Cumber, who would actually later become the state section director for MUFON in the state of Utah. But at age 16, he and his family were taking a vacation at Bottomless Lakes. This is just outside of Roswell, New Mexico. And Jim Cumber himself was an amateur astronomer. On this occasion, he did have a pair of 7 by 50 binoculars and was looking at the sky when he saw what appeared to be a satellite. As he says, as it passed overhead, I zeroed in on it with my binoculars, and I continued to watch it as it moved directly between 2 small stars and stopped dead between them. It didn't slow, it just stopped and hung there, dead still for several seconds. Then it went out, as if someone had turned off a light switch. So at this point he knew it couldn't be a satellite, and he was amazed when 15 minutes later 4 pairs of jet fighters appeared and began to perform a grid pattern over the area where he had seen this object. And Jim Cumber watched all of this through binoculars and was watching one of the pairs of jet fighters approach the area where the object had actually disappeared. And as he says in his own words, as this pair of aircraft passed through where the UFO had disappeared, the wingman to the right rear of the element leader flew directly through the point where the UFO had vanished, and he vanished as well. I was watching through the binoculars, and the wingman disappeared as if someone had flipped a switch. No navigation lights, no engine exhaust. The element leader flew on for perhaps 1 or 2 miles before he apparently noticed the wingman was gone. Then his air burners bloomed, and he dove straight for Walker Air Force Base at full burn, straight in with no approach circle. I looked up and saw all 6 of the other aircraft do exactly the same thing. They lit their burners and dove directly for Walker Air Force Base. Forget the approach pattern. Within 5 minutes, there wasn't a plane in sight. What happened to that aircraft near Roswell in 1965? Occasionally, even now, more than 30 years after the incident, I wake up at night with that very burning question in my mind. Seeing a jet fighter simply vanish before my eyes is something I'll never forget. So yeah, Jim Cumber later became the state section director of Utah for MUFON. That's how deeply this event impressed him. And now we move to case 16, which involves 2 anonymous sisters. And this was reported to the website Phantoms and Monsters anonymously by a gentleman who had another witness with him, his brother, but his brother had since passed away, so he felt it was important to get this story recorded before it was too late. And this is a very interesting case, again, of an observed abduction. I'll just quote the witness directly in this case and let him tell you what happened. I have not talked about this for 55 years, and it's time that I disclose a strange event which took place in 1965. My brother and I witnessed aliens abducting 2 young girls who lived in the trailer next door. We never told a soul about this encounter, and now that he has passed, I am the only person left to recount the events of that fateful night which changed our lives forever. We were living near Bossier City, Louisiana, as our father was working deep underground in the Air Force missile silos, and he was gone for days at a time in these bunkers. He had just come home on a 3-day leave, and we were so happy to be able to spend time with him. My brother and I played with our dad all day, and we were bushed come bedtime. I slept in the upper bunk, and my brother slept in the lower. Suddenly, around 4 a.m., we were both awakened by a low thundering sound in the most brilliantly colored light display just outside our window. I moved to the window and looked down to see my brother looking out. We both watched a flying saucer land in the field close to our neighbor's trailer. Our family was very close to these neighbors, and the 2 young girls living there were friends to my brother and myself. I can't recall their names, but they were approximately 7 and 10 years old. We debated about waking our parents, but were so frightened and thought if we woke them and they start turning on outside lights or walk outside with any weapons, there would be sheer panic. So we sat very quietly and simply observed. This flying saucer was about 50 feet in diameter and had multicolored lights around the perimeter. Everything beneath the craft was distorted and wavy, as it was gently settling down in the dirt field. There were 4 metal legs that slid down from the craft with round pads on each. All of the lights on the craft went out within 30 seconds after it landed. But a light blue glow started to envelop the craft, and it made the area around it glow as well. Then a ramp slid down from the craft and a door opened up. We could partially see inside. There was dull red and orange lights on the walls and an electrical crackling sound emanating from the interior. Then the interior lights went out, the weird sound stopped, and suddenly a figure started to walk down the ramp, followed by another. The first 2 beings were walking down the ramp and made their way into the light of our neighbor's yard. They looked human in shape and size, but moved in a way that made them function more like robots. Every movement was very smooth and effortless, as though they were moving about in water. They now remind me of the Blue Man Group from Las Vegas, because they were completely blue all over. Then 2 beings exited the craft, and they were green. Another 2, and they were red, until there were 6 of them in all. They walked in a line up to the door of the trailer. They passed right through the door without opening it, and that scared the heck out of us. We were asking each other, "Did you see that? What are they going to do with our friends?" Minutes later, they passed through the door again, and they were leading the 2 girls all the way back to the ship. The girls appeared as if they were sleepwalking, and even had their eyes closed, but walked just fine, without any help from these strange beings. The girls passed right through the door without it being opened too. Only about 5 minutes later, they exited the ship and led the girls back into the trailer, but when the beings passed through the door for the last time as they were coming out, they all crouched down slightly, turned, and looked directly at our window. Each one did this in succession, and they smiled and waved at us. Now at this point, my brother and I were in complete shock. We were unable to say a word. They entered the ship, and as the last one went inside, the interior lights came back on, the strange noise started up again, and the door closed. The ramp slid back up inside the craft, and as it slowly lifted off the ground, the 4 legs retracted up as well. The colorful lights came back on around the perimeter of the ship, and it slowly lifted skyward. It was about 25 feet in the air. Then it shot straight up and out of sight in less than a second. The last being, standing at the door of the ship, waved at my brother and I before it closed. That is the lasting image burned into my memory ever since that strange night. So finally he did report it to the Phantoms and Monsters website, and I'm glad he did, because as we've seen, it's, while unusual, not entirely unique. I do have my own case, which I am currently researching at this time. It's one of the reasons that I was inspired to do this video, because I actually did know of other cases. I covered these cases in my book, Not From Here, Volume 3. So I was quite surprised when I ran into my own case involving a lady in Florida who was being returned to her home following an abduction, and her father comes rushing in just in time to see this happen. And he asked her, what was going on? And is this what I think it is? Are you being taken? Because he himself was an abductee. And she admitted that yes, she was being taken by the ETs. And that was pretty much the end of the discussion. I'll have more details when I do further research on this. But it's another case of an observed abduction. And there are many others, but it starts to get repetitive. I might mention, of course, the case of Travis Walton, which occurred on November 5th, 1975. his coworkers watched him get struck by a beam of light from a UFO, and as you may know, they drove off and didn't see him actually taken, but it was close. Another very famous case of an observed abduction I won't get into because I already covered this case in depth in another episode called The Top 20 UFO Encounters in New York. This, of course, is the case investigated by Bud Hopkins involving a lady by the name of Linda Napolitano. This is the Brooklyn Bridge abduction case, which occurred on November 30th, 1989, and was allegedly observed by more than a dozen outside witnesses. It's sort of the classic case of an observed abduction. And again, I won't go into it because I already covered it in depth, but this case was presented in Bud Hopkins' full-length book, Witnessed. So that's another case of an observed abduction. And another case, I'll just mention one more, would be that of Betty Andreasson. Again, I won't get too deeply into her case because it's very well known. Her case was investigated by Raymond Fowler, and he's written a half dozen books on her case. She's written a couple herself. And in brief, one of her first encounters that she was actually conscious of was observed by outside family members. Betty Andreasson lived in Ashburnham, Massachusetts at the time. This was January 25th, 1967, and Greys came and took her from her house. But before they did, they were actually observed by her father, Wayno Aho, who saw them coming towards the house. As he says, and I quote, "The creatures I saw through the window of Betty's house were just like Halloween freaks. I thought they had put a funny kind of headdress imitating a moon man. It was funny the way they jumped on after another, just like grasshoppers. When they saw me looking at them, they stopped. The one in front looked at me and I felt kind of queer. That's all I knew." At that point, he passed out. Meanwhile, the figures continued to approach, and the next person who saw them was Betty Andreasson's daughter, Becky Andreasson. She saw a bright light outside and a silhouetted figure approaching, and she also blacked out. But it was a short time later, she spontaneously woke up and saw her mother, Betty Andreasson, talking to the Greys in the center of the family's living room. And as Becky says, describing one of these ETs, "He looks like a clay man talking to my mom, some kind of man creature. And right behind him to the right, there's a little one, and there are two after him that are just exactly like triplets. They look like clay. They are very kind and they don't mean any harm, but they're scary to look at. They look scary." So there you go. Those are all the cases I could find of observed abductions. I'm certain there are more. Yes, these cases are rare, but they're not unique. And I think they do have some very interesting things to tell us about the nature of the UFO phenomena. First is the fact that they're so rare. This shows us just how advanced the ETs are. If abductions number in the millions, and I think they probably do, then this shows how incredibly advanced the ET's ability is to hide, how to turn people off, how to suppress people's memories, how to influence people to move to a desolate location so they can do their abduction, how to stop traffic. All these different details show how incredibly advanced the ETs are. A second interesting insight, I think, is that these outlying cases, these observed abductions, show that ETs might not be perfect. Sometimes perhaps they do make mistakes, and certain witnesses are able to observe this. Or perhaps they're just letting people observe it. Perhaps they're letting people observe it on purpose, or perhaps they don't care, because there is a sort of an interesting pattern in these cases where a number of these people have not been returned, and that is unusual. But a third insight, and I think probably the most important one, is that these outside observed abductions prove that these cases are physically real. There are a number of researchers in this field who maintain that abductions are psychological events, subjective, not physically real. As these cases show, and I think as many other details show, these are physically real events. People are not where they're supposed to be when they're being taken. They're left with medical evidence, implants, and so forth. There are landing traces. There's many reasons to believe that these events are physical, and I think these cases of observed abductions add to that conclusion that these are physically real events. So yeah, I covered these cases in my book, Not From Here, Volume 3, and I think these are important cases and that everyone should know about them, and that they do have these interesting insights into the nature of the UFO phenomenon, and that's why I wanted to do this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. I want to thank you once again for watching, and until next time, keep asking questions, keep searching for the truth, and most importantly, keep having fun.